The locks had been changed while I was at the grocery store. I'm Mara, I'm 43 years old, and I stood on the porch of my grandfather's lake house on a Tuesday afternoon in July with 2 bags of food in my hands and a key that no longer fit, listening to the water move against the dock 30 yards away. The sound was exactly as I remembered it from every summer of my childhood, a low, patient lapping, completely indifferent to whatever was happening on the shore. I tried the key twice. Then I set the grocery bags down on the porch boards, very carefully, and looked out at the lake. Stillwater Lake had that quality of northern Minnesota water in July, dark green near the center, silver at the edges, the surface moving just enough to suggest depth. Grandpa Edmund had bought this property 41 years ago, when the land around Kellerton was still cheap and the idea of a family lake house was something you could build on a civil engineer's salary if you were patient and deliberate, which he was. He'd spent 3 summers building the dock himself. He used to say the dock was better than the house because he knew every board in it. He'd been gone 18 months. I tried my phone. No signal. The dead zone on this side of the property was reliable and total. I walked back to my car, drove to the edge of the gravel road where 2 bars of service flickered, and called my cousin Derek. He picked up on the 4th ring. "Oh," he said. "Right. Yeah, we were going to call you about that." "We." The word landed with a specific weight. "Derek," I said. "Why did someone change the locks?" A pause, not the pause of someone surprised, but the pause of someone who has rehearsed this conversation and is deciding which version to use. "There's been some discussion," he said. "About the property going forward. About what makes sense." "What discussion? With whom?" "Mom and Sasha and I sat down last week. We think, and this isn't personal, Mara, we think it makes more sense for the house to be managed by people who are actually going to use it consistently." The lake was visible at the end of the road, a slice of green between the pines. I looked at it while Derek talked. He kept saying going forward and practical and what Grandpa would have wanted, all the language of a decision already made, dressed up as a conversation still being had. "The house was left to all 4 of us equally," I said. "1/4 each. That's what the will says." "We know what the will says," Derek said, and his tone shifted, just slightly, just enough to tell me we had arrived at the part of the conversation he'd actually been waiting for. "We've been talking to an attorney about the options." I was 43 years old, standing on a gravel road in northern Minnesota, and I understood in that moment that whatever was coming had been in motion for considerably longer than a week. "Send me the locksmith's contact information," I said. "And tell your attorney mine will be in touch." I hung up before he could reframe it. I sat in the car for a while, the windows down, pine smell coming off the trees. The grocery bags were still on the porch. Inside them, a bottle of wine I'd bought for the week, a wedge of good cheese, the kind of small treats you bring when you're looking forward to something. I hadn't been looking forward to much lately. This trip had been the thing I was holding on to. I drove back to the house and sat on the porch steps with the grocery bags beside me and the useless key in my hand, and I thought about Grandpa Edmund, who had been methodical and fair and had drawn up a will that was entirely clear on the question of who owned what. A man who had spent 3 summers building a dock by hand because he believed that what you built yourself, you understood. I wondered when Derek had started talking to an attorney. I wondered who else had been in that room. My phone showed 1 bar. I sent a text to my own attorney, a woman named Christine Bauer in Minneapolis, whom I had retained for exactly nothing until this moment. "Call me when you get this. Family property dispute. Urgent." The text went through on the 2nd attempt. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. The sun was still high over the lake. Something had already shifted, sitting there on those steps, not grief, not anger, but something more deliberate. The feeling of a person who has just realized the ground is softer than it looked, and has adjusted her footing accordingly. The weeks before the lake house trip had been ordinary in the way that life is ordinary when you are managing a low-grade unease you haven't yet identified correctly. I work as an environmental consultant, water quality assessments, remediation planning, the kind of technical work that takes you to industrial sites and municipal watersheds and occasionally requires you to spend 3 days in a field collecting soil samples in the rain. It's not glamorous work. But it's mine, and I'm good at it, and it puts me in contact with lakes and rivers and wetlands in a way that still feels meaningful after 16 years of doing it. Grandpa Edmund was the reason I went into environmental science. He was an engineer who cared about the land he worked on in a way that wasn't fashionable yet, before anyone called it sustainability, and he passed that particular care directly to me. I'd driven up to Kellerton from Minneapolis intending to spend a week. I had a project finishing in late July and a clean month of August ahead of me, and the lake house felt like the obvious place to take it, the place it had always been, since I was a child. In the 6 months since Edmund died, I had been to the lake house 3 times. Each visit had been slightly different from the last in ways that were small enough to ignore and specific enough to note. On the first visit, in November, the key worked fine and the house was as I'd left it the previous summer, clean, closed up, the dock pulled in for winter. On the second visit, in February, I noticed that a chair from the living room had migrated to the screened porch without explanation. On the third visit, in May, there was a new coffee maker in the kitchen. A specific model, expensive, particular, that had not been there before. Derek's family used the house in March. Sasha had been up in April. I noticed the coffee maker. I made a note of it mentally and then let it go, because noticing things about your family's habits in a shared property is a path that leads to endless small grievances if you follow it too far. That was a mistake. Not dramatic, just a missed signal. Looking back, the coffee maker wasn't really about coffee. It was a territorial act, small enough to be deniable, clear enough to be read. Someone was establishing whose house it was starting to become. I saw it and filed it under personality differences and moved on. What I understand now is that every small encroachment that goes unnamed becomes permission for the next one. I wasn't reading the pattern, I was reading the individual incidents. The month before the locks changed, I had 3 conversations with my cousin Petra. Petra was Claudine's youngest daughter, the one who had always occupied the role of family mediator, the person you called when you needed to understand what was happening on the other side of a family tension without starting a war. She was 38, worked remotely as a data analyst, and had always seemed to sit slightly outside the family's competing agendas. She called herself the Switzerland of the situation, which I'd always found endearing. We talked on the phone, the 3 times. I told her I was planning to spend August at the lake house. I told her I'd been thinking about proposing a formal usage schedule, something that would give each of the 4 of us designated weeks and a shared maintenance system, the kind of structure that works in shared properties when people are willing to maintain it. Petra listened. She asked questions, good ones, the kind that helped me articulate what I actually wanted. She said she thought it was a reasonable idea and that she'd mention it to her mother. I remember being grateful for those conversations. I remember thinking, at least one person in this family is operating in good faith. I did not know, at the time, that Petra had spoken to Derek after every single one of those calls. I found that out later. The finding out came with a particular quality of cold that I wasn't expecting, not because I'd trusted Petra blindly, but because she had always been the one who said she was different from the others. The betrayal was in the self-presentation, not just in the act. Meanwhile, my work continued. I was in the middle of a remediation assessment for a lake property in Crow Wing County, contaminated shoreline, a former industrial site that a developer wanted to convert to residential. The irony of spending my professional life protecting lockshores while my grandfather's lakefront home was being quietly organized away from me was not lost on me, though I didn't frame it that way until later. I had a good colleague named Jo who worked with me on the Crow Wing project. She was 29, meticulous, and had the quality of precise people who notice when something is wrong with someone. She asked me once, in May, whether I was sleeping all right. Family stuff, I said. The lake house? How did you know? You've mentioned it 4 times this month, she said, with the mild tone of someone who keeps count. I hadn't realized I was mentioning it that often. The anxiety had been there for months, living below the surface of everything. I had attributed it to grief, Edmund's absence, the particular shape of a world without someone who had been its most reliable fixture. I was not wrong about that. But it wasn't only grief. Something else was accumulating, quietly, in the background. I felt it the way you feel weather coming, not clearly, but unmistakably. Christine Bauer called me back within the hour of my text. I was driving south on the county road, away from the lake, looking for a place to stay that wasn't the porch of a house I couldn't enter. I found a motel in Kellerton proper, clean, practical, the kind of place that has been the same since the 80s and is reliable precisely because of it, and I sat on the bed with the phone and laid out the situation for Christine in the clearest terms I could. She asked precise questions. The will. The exact language. The date probate had closed. The other owners' names and their relationship to the property. Whether there had been any written communication about the lock change. Nothing in writing, I said. Derek called it a discussion. He mentioned an attorney. Did he name one? No. Christine was quiet for a moment. Okay. Here's what's happening. They may be pursuing a partition action. That's a legal process to force the sale or physical division of jointly owned property. It's a legitimate legal tool and it's available to any co-owner. The question is what they're hoping to accomplish with it. They want to buy me out, I said. Or push me out entirely. Probably the former. They need your signature to sell. They can't simply remove you. A pause. But they can make it uncomfortable enough that you agree to sell at their price. I sat in the motel room and thought about the lock change, the particular bluntness of it, arriving while I was at the grocery store, without a call, without a message, without anything that resembled the minimum courtesy owed between family members. It was not a legal move. It was a message. What's the property worth? Christine asked. The house and parcel together? Lakefront in this county, probably $700,000. Maybe higher. A brief silence on Christine's line. Not surprise, recalibration. That changes the calculus, she said. What's your grandfather's will say about maintenance responsibilities, usage rights, right of first refusal? I need to look at my copy. Find it, she said. Tonight. That was the first turning point, not the lock change, but that conversation. Christine's questions forced me to stop feeling and start counting. The grievance had been emotional until that moment. They changed the locks, they excluded me, they treated me as disposable. The moment I heard the figure, $700,000, the emotional frame shifted into something harder. This wasn't about belonging. It had never been about belonging. It was about money, and I had been the only person in the situation who hadn't understood that yet. I drove back to Minneapolis that night. For hours, late enough that the highway was mostly empty, the dark trees pressing close on both sides of the road. I thought about Derek's voice on the phone, that particular flatness, the absence of discomfort. A man who had made a decision and had not expected it to require a defense. I thought about Petra. I thought about the 3 phone calls, and her careful questions, and the way she had said she'd mentioned my scheduling proposal to her mother. Had she? And what, exactly, had she said? In the morning, I called Petra directly. I wanted to let you know, I said, that I wasn't able to get into the house yesterday. Oh, she said. A beat too late. Why not? She already knew. The O had the quality of a word used to buy a second, not genuine surprise but the performance of it. I'd heard that inflection before, in other contexts, from other people. It was the inflection of someone who had been waiting for the call and was now deciding how to handle it. The locks were changed, I said. Derek said there'd been a discussion. I heard something about that, Petra said carefully. I wasn't part of it. I heard something about that. She knew. She had known before I called. When did you hear about it? I asked. A pause. I think Derek mentioned it. Before or after the locks were changed? The pause this time was longer. Mara. It's a straightforward question. I don't want to be in the middle of this, she said, and her voice had gone to the soft, pained register of a person who is declining to answer while presenting the declination as a form of suffering. I understood, in that moment, what the 3 phone calls had been. Even now, thinking about Petra is more complicated than thinking about Derek or Claudine. They were operating from open self-interest, at least that was honest. Petra had presented herself as someone outside the agenda while feeding information directly into it. The cruelty in that is precise. She didn't lie exactly. She just shaped what she said, and when she said it, and to whom. She gathered intelligence and called it friendship. That's a harder thing to recover from than an enemy who simply acts like one. Christine located a copy of the will through the probate records. I had my own copy, which I found in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, behind a folder of old tax returns. The will was clear. Edmund had divided the lake property equally between his 4 grandchildren, Derek, Sasha, Petra, and me. 25% each. Usage rights were unspecified, a common omission in family property documents, Christine told me, and the one most likely to cause exactly this kind of conflict. There was a right of first refusal clause. If any owner wished to sell their share, the other owners had 60 days to match any outside offer. There was no language permitting one owner to lock another out. Changing the locks without consensus is a violation of your rights as a co-owner, Christine said. They know that. Which means the lock change was never meant to be a permanent legal strategy. It was meant to provoke a reaction. What kind of reaction? An emotional one. Something they could point to and say, see, she's not easy to work with, she's making this complicated. They want you to either capitulate, agree to sell at their price, or overreact in a way that makes you look unreasonable. I thought about that. About the grocery bags on the porch. About the motel room. What do I do? I asked. Right now? Nothing dramatic. You document everything. Every communication. Every incident. You request in writing, through me, that they restore your access and provide a key. You begin a property usage log. Every time you use the property, you record it. And you get an independent appraisal. I did all of those things. Christine sent a formal letter to Derek's attorney, a man named Brent Volar, who had offices in Duluth and appeared to specialize in exactly this kind of family property work, outlining my rights as a co-owner and requesting immediate restoration of access. The response came back in 4 days. Derek's position: he was willing to buy out my share at assessed value, which the county tax records listed at roughly $420,000 total, meaning my share would be valued at $105,000. Less than a third of what an independent market appraisal would likely produce. Christine forwarded the offer with a one-word commentary in the subject line: insulting. I hired an appraiser. The independent assessment came back at $780,000 for the total property. My quarter, $195,000. The gap between what Derek was offering and what the market said my share was worth was $90,000. That number, $90,000, had a clarifying effect. There's something I understood in the math that I hadn't been able to access in the emotion. They had calculated, correctly, that grief makes people poor negotiators. A person who has just lost their grandfather, who is managing the tangle of family feeling and physical loss and the particular sorrow of watching a shared place become a contested one, that person will often accept less than they're owed, just to stop the bleeding. They had designed the lock change, the vague phone call, the insulting offer as a sequence. Step 1, destabilize. Step 2, appear reasonable. Step 3, propose terms that feel like relief. The only correct response to a sequence like that is to refuse to follow it. Through Christine, I received the formal notification that Derek, Claudine, and Sasha had jointly retained Volar and were filing for a partition action, a legal request to the court to either physically divide the property or force its sale and distribute the proceeds. It was, as Christine had predicted, their next move once the buyout offer failed. Partition actions are slow. Months, sometimes longer. During that time, the property sits in legal stasis, which favors the party with more patience and resources. I began to prepare. I pulled all communications, every text, every voicemail, every email, from the 18 months since Edmund's death. I organized them chronologically. I noted which conversations had happened after my calls with Petra, and how each had slightly anticipated information I'd shared only with her. The pattern was not subtle once I was looking for it. I also found something in the documents that Christine hadn't looked for yet, a clause in Edmund's original property deed, not the will itself, but the deed, which predated the will and had been filed with the county 41 years ago. The clause established the property as a family residential holding with a conservation covenant attached. The parcel could not be subdivided or commercially developed without unanimous agreement of all deed holders. Derek's partition action, if successful, would likely result in a sale. The conservation covenant meant that any sale required my written consent. I called Christine. "Read me that clause again," she said. I read it. A silence. Then, "Mara. This changes things considerably." The phone call that changed everything came on a Thursday morning in September. I was in my Minneapolis apartment, at my desk, working through a section of the Crow Wing County report when my phone lit up with an unknown number, a Minnesota area code, but not one I recognized. I almost let it go to voicemail. "Ms. Mara?" A man's voice. Older. Careful. "My name is Richard Cho. I'm an estate attorney in Kellerton. I handled your grandfather's affairs for many years before his death, and I've been wanting to speak with you." I sat up straighter. "I'm familiar with the partition proceeding," he said. "I've been following it. I wanted you to know there are some aspects of your grandfather's estate that I believe haven't been fully disclosed to you." "What aspects? Would you prefer to do this by phone, or would you be willing to come to Kellerton? Some of what I have to show you is in document form." I drove to Kellerton the following Monday. Richard Cho's office was on the second floor of a building on Main Street, modest, precise, the kind of law office that accumulates its authority through decades of careful work rather than impressive square footage. He was in his late 60s, with the particular calm of a man who has held a long string of other people's difficult truths and learned to carry them without strain. He showed me 2 documents. The first was a memorandum Edmund had filed with him 18 months before his death, before the diagnosis, before the final decline. In it, Edmund had outlined his intentions for the lake property in language that was unusually specific. He wanted the house maintained as a family space available to all grandchildren equally, with explicit preference that it not be sold within 15 years of his death unless all parties agreed. He had not incorporated this into the will. Cho explained that Edmund had intended to update the will and had run out of time, but the memorandum existed as a document of intent. "It's not legally binding in the same way as the will," Cho said. "But in a court proceeding about a partition sale, a judge will consider it." The second document was more unexpected. It was a letter, handwritten, from Edmund to Cho. Dated 11 months before his death. In it, Edmund expressed concern about Derek's financial situation. He had apparently known about debts that I had only heard referenced obliquely, and had written, with some bluntness, that he did not want the property sold to resolve any one person's financial situation at the expense of others. He had named Derek. I read that line twice. "He knew," I said. "He was a perceptive man," Cho said. I thought about what Derek had said on the phone, standing on the gravel road outside the lake house. What Grandpa would have wanted. He had said it with complete confidence. He had been completely wrong. The confrontation, if you could call it that, was not a screaming match. It wasn't a scene. It was a meeting at Christine's office in Minneapolis, with Derek and Valar present, in early October. Christine had filed our formal response to the partition action, incorporating the conservation covenant, the Cho memorandum, and the letter. The legal picture was significantly more complicated than Derek's team had anticipated. Partition of a property with a conservation covenant attached requires additional court approval. The memorandum of intent created a secondary evidentiary trail that the judge would have to weigh. The letter naming Derek in the context of financial pressure created a documented history that no one wanted produced in open court. Derek sat across the table from me and looked, for the first time in this process, like a man who had not fully prepared for what he'd started. "We can resolve this," Valar said. "There's a reasonable number here." Christine named a figure. It was within 12,000 of the full market appraisal. For my 25% share, if I chose to sell. Or, alternatively, Derek and Sasha could each sell their shares to me at the same assessed rate. Derek looked at the table. He looked at Valar. He looked briefly at me, the first sustained eye contact since this began. "I need to discuss this," he said. "Of course," Christine said. "You have 7 days." I didn't feel satisfaction in that room. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was closer to exhaustion, the specific fatigue of having spent months building something solid in response to something that should never have required it. Derek hadn't looked at me like an opponent. He'd looked at me like someone who had run a calculation incorrectly and was now revising it. That was its own kind of information. He hadn't hated me. He'd simply decided I wasn't going to be a problem. And then I was one. Derek did not buy my share. Sasha did not sell hers to me. What happened instead, after 4 days of negotiation conducted entirely through Christine and Valar, without any direct communication between family members, was a formal usage agreement, drafted and signed by all 4 parties including Petra, who had quietly requested to be included in the resolution despite having played no formal legal role. The agreement established designated weeks for each owner, a shared maintenance fund with equal quarterly contributions, and a clear prohibition on unilateral changes to the property without written consent from all owners. The lock situation was resolved via a formal acknowledgement that the original lock change had been a procedural error. Nobody called it what it was. That was a compromise I made deliberately. I let the language be soft so that the legal structure could be hard. My access was restored in November. I drove up on a Friday, arrived in the early afternoon, and used my new key to open the front door of Grandpa Edmund's lake house for the first time in 4 months. The house smelled like cedar and closed windows and the faint mineral smell of the lake that always found its way in somehow. The expensive coffee maker was still on the counter. I left it where it was. I walked through every room slowly. Edmund's reading chair was where it had always been. His engineering books on the shelves. A photograph on the mantel, all 4 of us grandchildren on the dock one summer, young enough that the years had compressed into generality. I looked at it for a while. I went out to the dock in the late afternoon light. The lake was silver and calm and very cold, the sky above it a dense October blue. I sat on the dock for probably an hour, doing nothing in particular, just watching the water, listening to it move against the pilings. The boards under me were the ones Edmund had laid by hand, replaced and refreshed over the years, but fundamentally the same structure, the same intention. He had built this to last. He had expected it to outlast him. Petra called in December. She was calling from a careful place. I could hear it in the first few words, the deliberate tone of someone who has rehearsed a conversation but knows the rehearsed version won't survive contact. She apologized. Not in a general way, specifically. She named what she had done. The calls to Derek, the information passed, the way she had positioned herself as neutral while functioning as something else. She said she'd been telling herself it wasn't her conflict to manage, and had understood, too late, that staying neutral while one side had information and the other didn't is its own kind of choice. I listened to all of it. "I appreciate you saying this," I said. "I'm going to need some time." "I know," she said. "We haven't spoken much since. That door isn't closed, but it's not open the way it was. Some trust, once it's been used against you, doesn't reconstitute on the original terms. That's not punishment. It's just the new geometry of things. I'm spending more time in Kellerton now. I took on a consulting project with the County Water Authority, runoff monitoring, shoreline assessment, exactly the kind of work I've been doing for 16 years but closer to home than I usually operate. I drive up on Thursdays, work Friday, spend the weekend at the lake house. The dock is mine to use. 1 week in 4 is designated to me. I go in shoulder season sometimes, when no one else is there, May, October, the weeks when the lake is doing something particular with the light. I drink my own coffee from the machine I brought up in September and left on the counter next to Derek's. There is no warmth between Derek and me now. Not hostility. We communicate through the shared calendar system Christine's office set up, brief and functional messages about scheduling and maintenance. He has been, since the agreement was signed, entirely correct in his behavior. That correctness has the quality of something performed rather than felt, but I'm not looking for him to feel differently. I'm looking for the calendar to be maintained. Grandpa Edmund's letter sits in a file in Christine's office. I have a copy. I've read it 3 times. What strikes me, still, is the quiet firmness of it, a man writing to his attorney about a concern he had, in plain language, without drama. He had named what worried him and asked that the record reflect it. He could not have known how useful that document would become. Or maybe he could. He was, after all, a precise man. The doc is still there. Every board. What this story maps, underneath the legal surface, is the particular way that family inheritance disputes reveal what everyone actually believed about power: who had it, who was owed it, who could be moved and who couldn't. Derek and Claudine and Sasha had built a model of the family in which Mara was a satellite, present at gatherings, connected to the property emotionally, but ultimately peripheral to the decisions about what happened to it. This wasn't necessarily a cynical construction. It may have accumulated over years of small confirmations. Mara lived in Minneapolis, not Kellerton. Mara didn't have children. Mara was self-sufficient. Each of these facts was absorbed and used, unconsciously, to construct the story that she would be the easiest to manage. The lock change was the first time that story was acted upon as if it were true. The flaw in that model was Edmund himself. He had seen what they either hadn't seen or had chosen not to credit, that the property meant something specific to Mara, and that the meaning was worth protecting in writing. His letter to Cho, naming Derek, naming the concern about financial pressure, stating clearly that he did not want the house sold to solve one person's problem at the expense of others, was an act of precise parenting across death. He could not be present for the dispute. He left instructions anyway. What Christine's strategy accomplished, and what Mara's own restraint enabled, was the slow collapse of a plan that had counted on emotional leverage. The lock change was designed to create disorder. Disorder was supposed to produce capitulation. Mara's response was to become more organized, not less. She documented instead of confronting. She retained an attorney before she called anyone in the family. She found the conservation covenant by reading the deed rather than assuming she knew what was in it. Every instinct to react emotionally was answered instead with a procedural step. This is not a natural way to process grief and betrayal simultaneously. It requires a kind of compartmentalization that costs something. But it was the correct strategy for the situation, and it worked because the other side had no counter to it. The Petra thread carries a different kind of weight than the Derek conflict, and that difference is instructive. Derek's behavior was self-interested and legally aggressive, problematic, but comprehensible. Petra's behavior was structurally more damaging because it compromised Mara's ability to trust her own read of the situation. When the person you believe is your honest informant is actually collecting information for the other side, you are navigating with a broken compass. Mara's decisions in the early months, her willingness to share her plans openly, her sense that at least one person was operating in good faith, were all made in the context of having Petra as a sounding board. The value of Petra's eventual apology was real, but it couldn't unmake those months of navigating by bad data. What the ending reflects, a functional legal agreement rather than a restored family, is the honest outcome of this kind of damage. Relationships don't return to their prior form after a betrayal of this magnitude and duration. They become something new, with different assumptions and different limits. That's not failure. It's accuracy. What I keep coming back to is this: Edmund built a dock by hand because he believed you should know every board in what you build. He applied the same logic to his estate, the memorandum, the letter, the conservation covenant on the deed. He left behind a structural record of what he actually intended, not just what he said. Most of us don't do that. Most of us assume that the people we love understand what we mean without being told precisely. And when that assumption holds, it's fine. When it breaks, when money enters the picture, or grief, or old competition between siblings who were never quite settled, the absence of the record becomes the argument. If there's one thing this story quietly insists on, it's the value of writing things down. Not because families are untrustworthy by nature, but because love alone doesn't survive a $70,000 gap in a real estate appraisal. Clarity is its own form of care. Edmund knew that. He built accordingly.